honest thank you for showing interest in this video. If you're like me, it's easier to check out and watch some action movie for an hour and 50 minutes than it is to engage a deeply challenging topic for that same amount of time. Life is hard, and often I want to escape it. But I felt compelled to make this video because the political divide that I see around me is only getting nastier, and I want to believe there's a different way to go about this. I'm a creative. I founded a nonprofit in 2010 and then a for-profit in 2018, but I'm not a YouTuber, or what my kids call a creator or an influencer, and I suck at being on camera, so this is a real stretch for me. But I wanted to share the following so badly that here I am. My invitation to you is to join me in this uncomfortable space and to take the time to dive into 3 amazing books that will get into the reasons for our political divide and offer some concrete steps to get us out of this mess. So let's jump in with both feet. We've all heard of the 12-step program for those struggling with addiction. Well, in a similar spirit, I've created a 5-step program for all of us who want to move beyond partisan politics. Now, I understand that's a lofty thing to say and to try to do, but some time ago, I became personally passionate about seeing if I could free myself from my own echo chambers. In no way have I arrived, but I have become a much freer person. And there were concrete steps I took to get there. And these are steps I believe that anyone can take to make progress. So that's the whole reason for I created this Be the Aisle channel. It's just to encourage others who also want to undertake this journey of becoming freer, more independent thinkers, particularly when we live in a society that's programming us to go along with one tribe or the other. All right, on December 20th, I'll drop the full-length video that unveils all 5 steps. But until the big reveal, I'm sharing this video which summarizes the 2nd step. It's one piece of the puzzle, and I'm hoping it will nudge you to want to engage politics differently and put an end to those fights you have with loved ones over politics. So, hint, hint, this video is not about getting your family to see the light and convert to your side, as nice as that would be. It's about the log in our own eyes and how to remove it. So here's the 2nd step in the program to move beyond partisan politics. Become aware of how our human psychology shapes our interaction with politics and practice listening to the best the other side has to offer. There are 2 parts to the 2nd step. The first is educating ourselves, about how all humans, conservative or liberal, go about thinking, believing, and acting. For this, I researched a lot of books, but found these 3 to be the most helpful. First, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Second, Divided We Fall by David French. And third, Good Reasonable People, The Psychology Behind America's Dangerous Divide by Keith Payne. I'm going to provide a summary of each of these books in this video, and that'll be the bulk of this video. The second part is to practice listening to the best the other side has to offer. This involves taking the time to do some long-form content reading, but not any long-form content. That's the key. It has to be the very best, the most thoughtful, not inflammatory or popular, the most thoughtful that the other side has to offer. By this, I mean that those of you who identify as liberal-leaning need to read certain conservative thinkers, and those of you who are conservative-leaning need to read certain liberal thinkers. I'll provide these lists near the end of this video and explain why these books made the cut. If our purpose is to truly be independent thinkers, we should want to read the best thinkers from every side and come to our own conclusions. I believe if people actually started doing this, we'd find out that almost none of us are full-blooded liberals or through and through conservatives. We're all various mixes or versions of both. And when we start to realize that and create new identities, that is going to change the political discourse and climate. So let's dive into part 1, becoming aware of how our human psychology shapes our interaction with politics. I'm going to give relatively shorter summaries to the first 2 books and focus a little more on the third because I think that will be the most helpful. The first book we're going to summarize is Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, written in 2012. And by summarize, I want to be clear. I'm not simply trying to distill exactly what Haidt has said. I'm selectively emphasizing the themes and insights that I believe are the most helpful to our cause. There are 3 parts to the book, and each part presents one major principle of moral psychology. First principle, this is the first third of the book, intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second. His claim is this: our intuitions guide us, and moral reasoning comes in afterwards as a skill we humans learn to further our social agendas, that is, to justify our own actions and to defend the teams we belong to. Haidt uses this metaphor of an elephant and a rider on the elephant. The elephant signifies our intuitions. The majority of our mental processing happens instinctively, outside of our awareness. And the rider represents our conscious reasoning, our awareness, the part of us that thinks it can and is steering the elephant. His point in this metaphor is not that our thoughts or reasoning isn't true or doesn't exist, but rather that it is extremely weak in comparison to the power and will of the elephant. In other words, most of our actions in life is determined by the intuitions of the elephant, and oftentimes our conscious reasoning operates to justify whatever the elephant is inclined to do. The key is to understand that the elephant is not serving the rider, rather the rider is serving the elephant. The rider, our reasoning, can do things the elephant can't, like look into the future and play out alternative scenarios in our head to help make better decisions in the present. And it can learn new skills and help the elephant succeed or avoid pain. But most commonly, it serves as the elephant's public relations spokesman. The key takeaway in all of these functions, though, is that the thinking or reasoning of the rider is almost always done in service of the elephant's desires. Haidt argues that it's not that our emotion is pitted against our cognition, it is that emotion is a type of cognition, and our emotions and intuitions are the dominant and guiding forms of human cognition. That is to say, our cognition is primarily employed by us to justify ourselves and our desires, often consciously and almost always unconsciously. As a result, Haidt says that trying to argue with someone is futile. We don't get people to change by throwing reasons at the rider. Change is most possible when we listen to the other person, which engages their emotions, engages their elephant, getting that elephant to lean our way via empathy. To do this requires that we learn to be able to see things from their perspective, to begin to understand not just what the person is saying, but why they're saying what they're saying. When we really become curious about another person instead of judgmental or filled with the desire to beat them, that is when people are most likely to be influenced. Even if you feel the other person is in the wrong and it seems obvious to you that they're fabricating justifications for their position, an important takeaway should be this: what they are doing is totally natural, totally human. I'm only human, after all, don't put the blame on me. So learn to lighten up, to give others more grace. I grant that some people wear their positions with such self-righteousness and hubris that giving them grace feels like you're fanning the flame of a forest fire. But even with these folks, the best way forward is rarely direct confrontation. You're better off deconstructing the psychological reasons why the person is the way they are silently in your head and coming into profound pity for the person. If you think they just need to wisen up and see the truth, then you aren't very enlightened either. You're not getting the psychology we're talking about. Haidt gives a bunch of examples showing how in everyday life we are continually engaged in confirmation bias, which you've probably heard of. But for the sake of review, he defines it as the tendency to seek out and interpret new evidence in ways that confirm what you already think. We can be quite good at challenging what other people think, but we suck at questioning our own thinking. When it comes from us, it's like our baby we protect at all costs. Haidt ends this section with this numbing sentence: if thinking is confirmatory rather than exploratory in these dry and easy cases, then what chance is there that people will think in an open-minded, exploratory way when self-interest, social identity, and strong emotions make them want or even need to reach a preordained conclusion? I recommend you read all of Haidt's chapter 4, titled Vote for Me. It's the best chapter in the book. Admittedly, this book is heavier or harder to read than the other two we're summarizing, but this chapter is packed with so much that will blow your mind. You'll probably come away a bit depressed about humanity, that is about our collective naivety for thinking we're rational creatures, when this chapter undresses us so harshly, it almost feels like rape. I mean, he has subsections that are titled, "We lie, cheat, and justify so well that we honestly believe we are honest." And he backs these statements up. Like I said, you'll be undressed, and there'll be more cellulite, warts, and nose hair than you thought possible. But please, please, please read this anyway. For us to be cured of our fighting over politics, we need to be fighting the right fights. We need an accurate diagnosis in order to get the right medicine. This chapter provides the accurate diagnosis. It's this: we are not rational creatures. We are self-justifying creatures. And this extends to how we do politics. And on page 90, he unveils the medicine. but I'll return to that later on when I unveil the pledge in another video. I gotta keep you in some suspense. Second principle, remember, 3 principles from Haidt. There is more to morality than harm and fairness. Harm, fairness, and liberty are the types of morality that dominate the minds of secular Western philosophies and civilizations. But Haidt argues at length that there are 3 other types of morality that conservatives value in addition to these first 3 strains. His metaphor here is that the righteous mind is like a tongue with 6 different taste receptors. He argues that liberals have only 3 of the 6 taste receptors firing, while conservatives have a more complex taste for and understanding of morality. Conservatives have all 6 moral taste receptors. Personally, I think Haidt's research and conclusions are accurate, but I don't think they're all that helpful at healing our political divides. I felt like a liberal reading this section will most likely come away still believing that the additional 3 components of morality that conservatives believe in are either not important or just plain wrong, and therefore be unmoved by this revelation. I think Haidt's hope in uncovering this difference is that the liberal person could learn to better understand and empathize with how conservatives see the world, and as a result, show more grace in their differences. But I'm just not that optimistic about human nature. And that goes not only for liberals, but conservatives as well. A conservative could very well read this section and come away thinking that they're morally superior and liberals are just deficient. As Haidt demonstrates quite well, liberals, a category of people he defines with the acronym WEIRD, W-E-I-R-D, stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic. These weird people have shed 3 large categories of morality that still exist in most of the world's cultures. Haidt calls these categories moral foundations. And the 3 that liberals have left behind are sanctity, authority, and loyalty. And I think he hits the nail on the head when he explains that these other moral categories go a long way in creating and maintaining social cohesion. In other words, they are features of cultures and religions that see the world as full of interconnections. They make sense when you perceive the world in terms of relationships, whereas Western liberals perceive the world as full of separate objects, and as a result, their morality has been reduced to a very individualistic morality. Their moral domain is limited to the ethic of autonomy, so its concerns are quite narrow. It really boils down to only concerns about individual harming, oppressing, and cheating of other individuals, versus the more traditional and communal morality that expands to include sanctity, respect for authority, and loyalty. Maybe the quickest way to capture what Haidt is saying is to read a page from his book. I'm going to tell you a brief story. Pause after you read it and decide whether the people in the story did anything morally wrong. A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. Nobody saw them do this. If you are like most of the well-educated people in my studies, you felt an initial flash of disgust, but you hesitated before saying the family had done anything morally wrong. After all, the dog was dead already, so they didn't hurt it right, and it was their dog, so they had a right to do what they wanted with the carcass, no? If I pushed you to make a judgment, odds are you'd give me a nuanced answer, something like, well, I think it's disgusting, and I think they should just bury the dog, but I wouldn't say that it was morally wrong. Okay, here's a more challenging story. A man goes to the supermarket once a week and buys a chicken. But before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it. Then he cooks it and eats it. Once again, no harm, nobody else knows, and like the dog-eating family, it involves a kind of recycling that is, as some of my research subjects pointed out, an efficient use of natural resources. But now, the disgust is so much stronger, and the action just seems so degrading. Does that make it wrong? If you're an educated, political, liberal Westerner, you'd probably give another nuanced answer, one that acknowledges the man's right to do what he wants, as long as he doesn't hurt anyone. But if you're not a liberal or libertarian Westerner, you probably think it's wrong, morally wrong, for someone to have sex with a chicken carcass and then to eat it. For you, as for most people on the planet, morality is broad. Some actions are wrong, even though they don't hurt anyone. Understanding the simple fact that morality differs around the world and even within societies is the first step toward understanding your righteous mind. I think you get the point. The modern liberal or weird person might be turned off by the example he gives, but does not classify it as immoral. But most traditional and conservative cultures around the world, including the one I'm from, would label the man's intercourse with a chicken as the violation of sanctity and therefore immoral. Again, I don't feel that the second part of the book is as helpful in our pursuit of shedding our biases, but it may be helpful to you. It certainly made for a fascinating read, as you could see from the section we just read. And I would add that although Haidt is a secular liberal, I was really impressed by how it seemed to me that he tried hard to see and enumerate the advantages of traditional and conservative worldviews. I have serious respect for Jonathan Haidt as someone who's trying to move beyond his own biases. All right, the third principle, our morality binds and blinds. In the third section of the book, Jonathan Haidt makes the case that humans are usually very selfish creatures, competitive like other primates, which he ties to our evolution. But he says that in addition to competing with other individuals, we have learned to compete with other groups. And in the process, we have learned that there are times when it is advantageous to come together for the sake and survival of the group. His main phrase goes like this: humans are 90% chimp and 10% bee. The 10% bee referring to the hive instinct in bees, where the good of the group can transcend our individual interests at times. I like how he identifies both the good and the bad in this. He explains how this hive instinct facilitates altruism and heroism on the one hand, but also war and genocide on the other. In other words, it isn't necessarily good or evil. There is the latent potential for either or both. After chapter 4, I'd say the last chapter in the book, chapter 12, titled, Can We All Disagree More Constructively?, is the second most important chapter. In it, Haidt has a section called The Left's Blind Spot, Moral Capital. And it's absolutely fascinating. Fascinating in part because we so rarely see someone deconstruct their own political biases and realize there's truth on the other side. For Jonathan Haidt, it happened when he picked up the book Conservatism, a volume edited by Jerry Muller. I'd love to read like 5 pages from this chapter, but I'm sure that'd be a violation of copyright or plagiarism or something. So here's a poignant snippet taken from page 289. Here's the line that quite literally floored me. What makes social and political arguments conservative as opposed to orthodox is that the critique of the liberal or progressive arguments takes place on the enlightened grounds of the search for human happiness based on the use of reason. As a lifelong liberal, I had assumed that conservatism equals orthodoxy, equals religion, equals faith, equals rejection of science. Side note, faith does not have to equal the rejection of science. That cliche always irks me, but back to him. It followed, therefore, that as an atheist and a scientist, I was obligated to be a liberal. But Muller asserted that modern conservatism is really about creating the best possible society, the one that brings about the greatest happiness given local circumstances. Could it be? Was there a kind of conservatism that could compete against liberalism in the court of social science? Might conservatives have a better formula for how to create a healthy, happy society? I kept reading. Muller went through a series of claims about human nature and institutions, which he said are the core beliefs of conservatism. Conservatives believe that people are inherently imperfect and are prone to act badly when all constraints and accountability are removed. Yes, I thought. See Glaucon, Tetlock, and Early in chapter 4. Our reasoning is flawed and prone to overconfidence, so it's dangerous to construct theories based on pure reason, unconstrained by intuition and historical experience. Yes, see Hume in chapter 2, and Baron Cohen on systemizing in chapter 6. Institutions emerge gradually as social facts, which we then respect and even sacralize. But if we strip these institutions of authority and treat them as arbitrary contrivances that exist only for our benefit, we render them less effective. We then expose ourselves to increased enemy and social disorder. Yes, see Durkheim in chapters 8 and 11. Based on my research, I had no choice but to agree with these conservative claims. Haidt then proceeds to demonstrate that conservative philosophy does a much better job than liberal philosophy at preserving moral capital, the resources that sustain a moral community. Liberalism is naive to think it can discard traditions and constraints quickly without destroying the social fabric. But Haidt wisely balances this by pointing out that despite, or maybe because of this commitment conservatives have to tradition, that they often fail to notice certain classes of victims, fail to limit the predations of certain powerful interests, and fail to see the need to change or update institutions. He concludes the chapter in the book by presenting what I take to be his own synthesis of liberal and conservative thought, his opinion on how we need both and how one could or should use both to create the best possible society. On page 294, he writes, "In Chinese philosophy, yin and yang refer to any pair of contrasting or seemingly opposed forces that are in fact complementary and interdependent. Night and day are not enemies, nor are hot and cold, summer and winter, male and female. We need both, often in shifting or alternating balance. John Stuart Mill said that liberals and conservatives are like this, a party of order and stability and a party of progress and reform, are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life." Haidt does go on to describe the ways he thinks we as an American society should be liberal and conservative, but I'll let you read that and be the judge. What I admire and want us to meditate on is this idea that there is wisdom on both sides. My big personal goal has been to free myself from partisan allegiance as much as I can, to sit back and truly decide for myself what I want to believe, no matter what side it comes from. Now on to our second book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation, written by David French in 2020. Unlike Jonathan Haidt and Keith Payne, French is not a secular liberal. He's a conservative Christian lawyer. But because the terms liberal and conservative are employed in sloppy and dishonest ways in the media, I feel like David French often finds himself in no man's land. So much of Trump's agenda didn't resonate with French's Christian faith and conservative values that he couldn't get behind Trump. So many contemporary Republicans have shunned French. But if you're familiar with French's books and ideas, he is clearly a classic conservative. So most liberals are suspicious of him. And like the other two authors, there are places I disagree with French as well. But, and this is my essential plea to anyone listening to this, let's try to listen to people from their side and look for reasonable arguments to help ourselves grow. I think French has more intellectual and moral integrity than most of our nation's politicians. He opens his book by sharing a bit of his bio, how he was a staunch Republican for decades, how he was infuriated at the support Bill Clinton continued to receive from Democrats despite adultery, maybe even rape, and his lies to cover it up. But French adds this paragraph right away. Yes, I could see that multiple Republicans faced their own sex scandals. Newt Gingrich was having his own affair even as Republicans pursued Clinton, for example. But I possess the normal partisan mind. The normal partisan is able to see flaws on his own side. Only a fanatic is totally blind to their side's flaws. But he sees them as exceptional. Flaws on the other side, by contrast, are emblematic. When confronted by wrongdoing in his own tribe, the normal partisan indignantly turns to the media and to their fellow citizens and demands, "Don't judge us by the crazy few." And then just as indignantly, he looks at the worst actors from across the aisle and says, "Look at what your ideas cause. Look at what they're really like." The mask has slipped. Moreover, partisans know their own narratives intimately. We believe our own stories. That's from page 4. I could go on, but you get the drift. You see why I like French. He's someone who actually believes the log in his own eye is a problem. He's not just paying that idea lip service. And he continues in the introduction to talk about his time in the service in Iraq in 2007 and the violence he witnessed between the Shiite and the Sunni. And the revelation he had while in Iraq was this, that the conflict itself became reason enough for sustaining the conflict. Violence begets violence is no joke. And when he came back to the States and saw the irrational arguments and fighting between the left and the right, it clicked. Humans justify their side and egregiously amplify the flaws of the other side. And the more we separate ourselves out into distinct cultures and tribes and information silos, the more we can justify not just the need to win an election, but the desire to dominate and even annihilate an enemy. The first chapter reviews how we live in our literal bubbles, geographically that is. There are fewer and fewer purple states and more states that are consistently red or blue, with the blue down in the coast and the red in the south. Here is a bit of troubling data. In 1992, only 38% of American voters lived in a landslide county. In 2016, that number hit a record high of 60%. His second chapter is summarized in the title, Geography plus Culture plus Fear equals Secession. And French spends the chapter recalling the atmosphere that preceded and precipitated the Civil War, most notably how differently the cultures framed the situation and how fear was a key tool in mobilizing for war. The third chapter is dedicated to demonstrating how currently the right feels like they are under attack from the left, and the left feels like they are under attack from the right. And there's no sorting out which side is correct and which isn't, because they are comprised of two different cultures with distinct values. So each side is right in its own eyes according to its own values. French's fear is that this deep cultural divide, combined with the fact that this divide follows geographically contiguous regions, is eerily reminiscent of the conditions that sparked the Civil War. And the fourth chapter suggests that it's historically and logically naive to ignore the growing violence and the potential for the political division to become an overtly violent struggle. French then does what I'm doing elsewhere in this video, naming the most important chapter in a book. And he informs his readers that it's chapter 5, a chapter arguing that an academic paper by Cass Sunstein in 1999 titled The Law of Group Polarization is the key to explaining America. While it's commonly understood that group deliberation leads to better outcomes, there's a qualifier to this rule. If you only receive counsel from people who will tell you what you want to hear, then you will not be in a better position to make a wiser choice. For us to benefit from group deliberation, we need to be in conversation with those who could bring something new to the table, to challenge our way of thinking. But when we say we are more polarized as a society in America, we are admitting that we are clustered with like-minded folks more and more, caught in echo chambers. And what Sunstein shows in this paper is that when people of like mind gather, they become more extreme. The power of group think over our individual mind and opinions is frightening. Sunstein cites the famous Salman Ash study that demonstrated how when peer pressure is strong enough, people are willing to abandon the direct evidence of their own senses to go along with the group's will. A quote, in other words, group pressure, the pre-deliberation tendency, was so strong that individuals would rather be clearly wrong than clearly alone. Man, I feel like that's one of those divine words from the Lord, something we could read in a Lectio Divina kind of fashion, just to let it sink in. We would rather be clearly wrong than clearly alone. If that is the case, which I believe it is, one might be tempted to think this whole video is a waste of time. I've wondered about that. But logic then would suggest that the solution is to create a new group of independents, free thinkers who are not going to align themselves so strong with the left or the right because they realize how this is tearing apart our nation. There needs to be enough individuals who can commit to leaving the left and the right behind for something that's a blend. And that new something can function as a third group, a new safer place to belong, a new political identity. Now, obviously, human psychology will continue to be human psychology in this new setting, in this new group. So us who want to be the aisle, will in some sense now be in opposition to both the left and the right. But here's the thing. I think that is exactly what is needed in this moment to get this nation back to a place of legitimate dialogue and more rational decision-making. We need a groundswell of independence who grows so large in numbers that the Democratic and Republican parties have no choice but to move toward the middle because they're losing constituents. The Democratic and Republican parties aren't going anywhere, but as I see it, they cannot be reformed from within. The law of polarization has taken hold. It has them by the jugular. It's up to people like you and me to envision a third way and make it popular enough that the two warring tribes have to listen. I'll continue that thought in another video. Back to David French. French further teases out what this polarization means and looks like in the subsequent chapters. One thing he notes is that how more than ever before, our political identity is this kind of mega identity, an identity under which all of your other identities exist. As this political identity exercises its power, people's opinions conform to its muscle. Precisely as each party becomes more extreme in its echo chamber, people, in an effort to fit in, conform to more and more extreme views because they don't seem extreme when you're swimming in them. Does a fish notice this, the water around it? What's funny is that while French kind of outlines how he moved from conservative to something in the middle, I've had the opposite, or the same experience. In my case, I moved from the left to the middle, or better put, I have a blend of liberal and conservative views such that neither tribe is a good fit. But what prompted me to start questioning things was exactly what we're talking about. I noticed how my friends, my group, my tribe, if you will, allowed for some diversity back in the early 2000s when I was in my undergrad and grad programs. But then I started noticing, especially around like 2015, 16, that diversity vanished amongst close friends. Friends who were more intelligent than me, friends with PhDs. But it just became super clear to me that all these thinking friends couldn't be having the same kinds of revelations of truth simultaneously. That'd be empirically impossible. What was happening was obviously a kind of peer or group pressure, a kind of identity formation resulting from these friends being in echo chambers and wanting to fit in. I still love these friends. We're all guilty of this. But I totally believe this is what happened and is happening. It wasn't long after this realization that I figured out that to protect myself, I needed to become news sober. Yes, news sober, which for me meant quitting NPR. It was really the only news I was taking at the time. I wasn't watching TV. And again, we'll get into that much more later on because that's very important. A kind of interesting thought experiment French takes on is what it would look like if California left the Union or if Texas left the Union. French gives these imaginary but very realistic sounding backstories or plot lines to show how this isn't far-fetched. I came away from these two chapters with a very visceral sense of living in two Americas instead of a single United States of America. I never saw this movie, but the preview seemed to be capturing the feel of these chapters. It's a recent movie, I think 2024, called Civil War. And there was a scene from the trailer. I'll show you here.
There's some kind of misunderstanding here. What? Well, you're American, okay?
Okay. What kind of American are you?
You don't know?
These fictional, but maybe not so fictional, chapters do a good job of getting the reader into the mental space to understand and be prepared to listen to what French offers as the best solutions to this problem. So in the final chapters, he outlines 3 steps or beliefs or movements, whatever you want to call them, to perhaps not fully reconcile America, but to enable America to survive, continue on as an imperfect, but still exemplary democratic nation. A nation one could be proud of, and a nation someone would want to live in. The first principle he gives is to recommit ourselves to pluralism. French cites an article that says America is divided between competing economic systems, classes, and cultures, and that one has to win while the other has to lose. And French's fear is that this idea from this article, this kind of thinking, that our side, whether that be the Democrats or the Republicans, they're both guilty of this, has to win. This need to beat the other side has become so entrenched. The other side has become so vilified that each side now truly believes that the nation will only be healed when the other side is forced into submission. But French, like Mr. James Madison, whom he quotes, argues that this quest for uniformity via dominance is futile. We need to recommit ourselves to the idea of pluralism, which French starts by explaining that what pluralism is not. Pluralism doesn't mean you can't still try to persuade the other side to see things as you see them. It doesn't mean that you don't try to get your political party to win. It doesn't mean you stop trying to make converts. Rather, to embrace pluralism, citizens truly need only to embrace 2 limitations on their quest for ultimate ideological victory. These are the 2 limitations. First, you need to defend the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself, even when others seek to use those rights to advance ideas that you may dislike or even find repugnant. And second, you should defend the rights of communities and associations to govern themselves according to their values and their beliefs, so long as they don't violate the fundamental rights of their dissenting members. The second is to rediscover tolerance. Here, French immediately argues that contemporary intolerance is as much a problem for progressives as it is for conservatives. It's probably worth quoting at length. So what is the true version of tolerance? Not long ago, a psychiatrist who writes under the pseudonym Scott Alexander produced an illuminating piece describing the distortion of tolerance in modern American discourse. He cleverly outlines how tolerance has simply come to mean, I like historically marginalized groups and nothing more. In other words, he describes how a person on the left might advertise their tolerance by broadcasting their regard for gays, lesbians, bisexuals, asexuals, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, transgender people, and Jews. But Alexander next posits one question to liberals that cuts to the heart of the matter and demonstrates why they don't truly understand what tolerance means. Well, what do you think is wrong with gay people? Their answer would be immediate. What do you think I am? Some kind of homophobic bigot? Of course, I have nothing against gay people. If that's the case, then progressives are not tolerating anything. The word tolerance, of course, implies that there is something to tolerate. True tolerance, according to Alexander, is respect and kindness toward members of an outgroup, not respect and kindness toward members of what others would define as an outgroup, but rather respect and kindness towards people who are out of your group. You get the difference, you get the point. It's a profound one. The third step French advances is a return to federalism. Well, I should add that he had another chapter in between, maybe we call that step 2.5. It's a chapter calling for movement of grace. I found it interesting because it was like he felt compelled to put out there the real ultimate solution to get the root of the problem, but then kind of retracted from it, or at least glossed over it, because in his mind it was too idealistic, too unrealistic. It wasn't honest enough about how human nature is unable to sustain a gracious posture towards one another. So it's like something in him wanted to say it, but his logical mind had to discard it. So, yeah, back to federalism. French really goes to bat for federalism, and I think these chapters are worth reading. For those of you who haven't taken a history or civics course in a long time, don't be fooled. Federalism is not advocating for a large federal government. To the contrary, it's the allocation of power to smaller geographies, to state and local governments to rule their constituents with more autonomy. I like local economies, local agriculture, and more emphasis on local governance. So there is much that is appealing to me about this, and perhaps it would go a long way in permitting America to be a more peaceable quiltwork of cultures. Some areas would just be more conservative, some more liberal. Isn't that what we should expect in a diverse, pluralistic nation? Or, as David French wonders, are we too uncomfortable with the notion that there will be many places in our country that govern in ways that are upsetting to us? Are we less of a United States then? And if so, are there political and economic consequences to this that we'll regret? I do think French hits the nail on the head, how each political party is currently hypocritical. So when the Republicans lose the presidency or their power in Congress, they become cheerleaders of returning more power to the states. And when Democrats are not in office and don't have a congressional majority, they do the same thing, advocate for more state autonomy. But each party all of a sudden likes the central government when they are in power. Perhaps French is right in that skewing more power, more decisions to the states would lessen the incentive to have these huge fights to have control over the national government. I honestly don't know. I feel like I'm in over my head in these waters, so I'd love to hear your comments below. I think the main thought that cycled through my head as I read through his closing chapters was simply this. I don't see the solution, the will to change, to be a more pluralistic, tolerant, federalist, or gracious country coming from within the ranks of either side. What is abundantly clear to me is that people are going to have to divorce themselves from their party allegiance and echo chambers and somehow generate a loud enough voice to begin to steer this ship in a different direction. Neither party is redeemable, but maybe both could become better versions of themselves if they have to respond to a mass exodus, a grassroots movement of independents sick of the partisan fundamentalism. This is going to take courage, but what is the alternative? Look at what's happening right now. The problem is that when one side turns to incendiary rhetoric, as we're currently witnessing, the other side is lit on fire. They don't counterfire with cooling waters. We point to what was said as evidence that our rage is justified. And in no time, we've got two sides who have dehumanized the other. And that is very much what we have. And people on both sides, who in all their circumstances really do want to live peaceably, are caught up in this stream of hate. We see the other side is so wrong that clearly they are less than human. It reminds me of a video from YouTube that my son showed me.
This footage of a wildebeest getting killed by lions made me feel sad for the wildebeest. So I used computers to turn the wildebeest into a Nazi. Now I'm glad that it's dead.
The video is obviously meant to be funny, and in every way what the Nazis did was subhuman. But ultimately, to take that next step and use their actions, however atrocious, to justify thinking of them as less than human, and therefore violence against them as okay, is a recipe for a never-ending conflict. The answer is that we must do everything in our power to be on guard against the hate, not from outside of us, but from within us. You can't control the cruel things a politician might say or endorse or do, but you can control how you react. I believe as once a wise man who said, hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And that's not a guarantee that love will win every battle. That man was shot to death. But again, what is the alternative? To let our hate swell into genocidal tidal waves? That's what history shows us happens. Hate is a malignant cancer. It will yield death. I don't think David French is engaged in hyperbole. The direction our polarization is taking us is dangerous. And the only way to truly curtail it is not for your side to beat the other side, nor is it for you to wait until the other side repents. It's for you and I to address the hate in our own hearts. That is how this political division will not snowball into an even worse nightmare. On to our third and final book review, Good Reasonable People by Keith Payne. Let's summarize his findings in one sentence and then unpack. Here's my sentence. It's not a Google AI summary. Payne argues that all humans, liberal, conservative, and everything in between, all humans want to see themselves as good and rational people, and that we have a psychological immune system that is constantly and selectively looking for evidence to back this up and rejecting evidence that would suggest otherwise. And since we're social beings, people who find a sense of identity in the groups we belong to, we extend this self-justifying bias to our group, but unfortunately give no such grace to those outside of our group. In his introduction, Payne reveals some of his cards, sharing a bit of his personal story. And we learned he was raised a conservative and is now a liberal. Hold on, you conservatives listening to this. I'll critique him for that later on. He goes on to share how the point of this book is not so much to list off how conservatives and liberals are different. For something like that, you could read a book called Priest or Pickup. I read it a while back, and it's not that profound. It's kind of stating the obvious. But anyway, Payne is more interested in why these differences have created such a divide. And part of his conclusion is that underneath these differences lies some foundational similarities. Okay? So at one point, he argues that there really is no liberal mind or conservative mind. There is only the human mind, and all humans share the same psychological hardware. Instead, his research suggests that our political tribes are primarily the result not of our inner essences, but of our circumstances. It is our circumstances, some of which are out of control, some of which are within our control, that position us in time and place and surrounded by people and a story that we then try to make sense of based on where we're standing. Here's a quote from Payne. To many people, the idea that liberals and conservatives differ not in our minds, but in our circumstances feels unsatisfying. When we get into arguments with people on the other side, they certainly seem deeply different. When I give talks about my research, audience members will often come up to me afterward and tell me about a relative or a high school friend on the other side who is so irrational, there must be something deeply wrong with them. I think the simpler explanation is that there's something in all of us that desires, maybe even needs, to see them as utterly alien from us. Because if we are not essentially different, and our differences follow from the hands we are given to play in life, then that means that you or I could easily have been on the other side if things had shaken out a little differently. That's an uncomfortable thought for many people. Although this book is about the psychology of our political divisions, it is not about what is wrong with the other side. It is about understanding our own minds, our own circumstances, and our own blind spots as much as understanding those of the other people. In the chapters that follow, I'll explore how history, race, class, religion, and urban versus rural living set us on different paths and how we come to rationalize our own point of view as the only right point of view. Chapter 1, the roots of our division, time, place, and history. In this first chapter, Payne spends time reflecting on where he grew up in Kentucky, a small town with a population of 400, in a little house off Highway 60, a place that's, he says, a literal divide between the North and the South, where the Underground Railroad went right through his town. He tells this gripping story of Josiah Henson, a story dripping with American values like stand your ground, beware of evil sexual sin, and the folly of drunkenness. It says the elevation of families sticking together, following your conscience, and the need for honor and the sin of deceit, and the pursuit of freedom. You really need to read this for yourself. I won't do it justice. But the takeaway is profound. Josiah Henson is a moral hero by any reckoning. Yet the people of this town, where Keith Payne grew up, are reluctant to celebrate him and remember this history because to do so would be to acknowledge that the group they identify with, white folks, were not the heroes but the villains in this history. And our psychological immune system wants to ward off evidence that we are not good people and focus on alternative interpretations and other attributes to prove our goodness. The fact that many modern day Americans, despite sharing the same values and principles of this story's hero, Josiah Henson, because of their social group and upbringing, are more prone to demonstrate loyalty to their group over and even against the values they elsewhere espouse. Payne's point, our history and context matters. It often determines what we believe. Chapter 2, Why You Can't Reason with Them, the Psychological Immune System. Probably the most insightful novel chapter in the book. Here's a quote from page 28. The basic observation that people use motivated reasoning to protect their psychological well-being is one of the most consistent findings in all of psychology. And right away, another quote from page 29, maybe my favorite quote in the whole book. Take, for example, a study that asked participants to evaluate two welfare policies, one of which provided generous benefits and the other much less generous. In general, Democrats would be expected to support the generous policy and Republicans to favor the less generous one. But this study also varied which party was said to be proposing the policies. One group read that Democrats proposed the generous policy, as might be expected. The other group read that the Republicans proposed a more generous policy and Democrats favored the stingy one. When party information was included, Democrats strongly preferred whichever policy the Democrats proposed. Ouch. And Republicans preferred whatever Republicans proposed. Party mattered much more than the actual policy substance. Scads of studies like this have been done, and the results are almost always the same. A review paper examined more than 50 studies of politically motivated reasoning and found that partisan motivated reasoning was consistent, and it was symmetrical for Democrats and Republicans. The authors gave the paper the rather discouraged sounding title, At Least Bias is Bipartisan. This is unbelievable. Think about this. Especially liberals. I know a lot of you. I was one of you. And I think you like to think that you're smarter than this. You're educated, right? All the stereotypes. But the evidence is clear. It was symmetrical for Republicans and Democrats. Do you realize what this means? It means we can't trust ourselves. It means we can't trust ourselves. It means our party loyalty, our desire to fit into the crowd, just like in middle school, dominates our desire for truth, for being a free thinker. We care more about our tribe than our nation. In her book, Uncivil Agreement, Liliana Mason hammers home the same profound point. A Pew poll from June 2013 found that under Republican President George W. Bush, 38% more Republicans than Democrats believed the NSA surveillance programs were acceptable, while under Democratic President Barack Obama, Republicans were 12% less supportive of NSA surveillance than Democrats. The question prompt was identical. The only difference was the party of the president. As in Cohen's experiment, it is likely that these voters, if asked, would have provided logical reasons for their change of heart. But, as Cohen experimentally demonstrated, the influence of party loyalty is capable of reversing a single person's well-argued issue position without them even realizing it.
Are you frightened?
Yes.
Not nearly frightened enough.
We should be more scared. This information is profound. And it's the reason I felt compelled to, maybe it's childish or, idealist, but to start this Be the Owl channel, is to bring these kind of things up, to think about them collectively. Motivated reasoning isn't a fiction. It's our hardware. And if we aren't aware of it and don't take some precautionary measures, we are dooming ourselves to be locked in an eternal partisan struggle.
So what now, Jack Sparrow? Are we to be two immortals locked in an epic battle until Judgment Day and the trumpets sound? Or you could surrender.
So here's what we need. We need to recognize that motivated reasoning is similar to what therapist Terry Real calls objectivity battles. When a couple is arguing about the facts, naively thinking that if you throw more facts at a person, or if you just get them to agree on the facts, then the problem will be solved. When in reality, what we as humans want is to be heard. So stop our self-justifying and just we need to listen to that person. We need to care about others enough to listen to them. But this ties into the second part of our present political problem. We have sorted ourselves out into warring tribes. And this only increases our tendency to engage in motivated reasoning. When our social settings are homogenous, studies show an increase in motivated reasoning. In other words, our own heads are stuck up the butt of our political party. They're lost in the echo chamber. We are given the arguments the party wants us to consume on a platter, and we happily devour them and ask for Kool-Aid to wash it down. I know I've been guilty of this for years. And even now, I'm sure I'm still a sucker. Our cognitive systems value self-protection. Mine's no exception. Even when we're wrong, we either look for an excuse to lessen the severity or rationalize our error, or sometimes we outright deny or bury our wrong. It doesn't take a PhD in psychology to recognize what's going on. It's quite simple. We do this to protect ourselves, to protect our identity, because being a good person is important to us. Payne talks about some studies that show just how much our true selves, our identity, is linked to this idea that we're good people. We may have different definitions of what being a good person means, but it is a universal human desire or need to be seen as a good person. For example, when a loved one gets dementia, they may lose memory or become less creative or social and still feel like the same person, but changes in moral traits like trustworthiness or compassion left family members feeling like they no longer knew the person. And we also have a deep desire to have a high opinion of the groups we belong to. This need to justify ourselves extends to the groups we identify with. Payne cites some excellent studies that you really should read that capture how trivial a group can be and still evoke a psychological reaction. We are so quick to fly information with our flock, and the big negative to all this is that we naturally create boundaries then between our tribe and others. We have our in-group and the rest are outsiders. And that self-justifying, always rationalizing voice in our hearts, trying to protect our fragile egos, makes the same rationalizing efforts to those in our group. I'm a good, reasonable person. My group needs to be a good and reasonable group. We want to belong to the right group. Think of how often we're signaling. What's that all about? I recently saw a bumper sticker that said, I bought a Tesla before Elon went crazy. That communicates very clearly the owner of the car is insecure and needs to make sure everyone knows what side of the aisle he's on. There's a great quote near the end of this chapter where Payne says that reasoning has developed not simply to find truth, but to win friends and influence people. That is, to increase our status in the groups we care about. We know the outcomes we want in life, and so we generate the arguments we need to get us there. Our reasoning was hijacked from the outset. Again, this is what Jonathan Haidt said, and this is sobering. But there are systems we can put in place to combat these human weaknesses. Okay, that's the hope. The 5-step video I'm releasing December 20th is going to go there. But for now, it's enough that we are awakened to the severity of the situation and to recognize how we don't stand outside the problem, but that we're a part of the problem. Chapter 3, Ideology Without Ideas. Payne begins this chapter trying to give a little more definition to the words conservative and liberal. I appreciate that he's trying to break these convoluted terms down and make them more accessible. I'm not sure he does the best job. Feels a little cliche to me. You can read him decide what you think. He boils conservatism down to a less optimistic view of human nature which benefits from hierarchy, structure, and tradition, best captured in a government that maintains social order. After outlining Edmund Burke's conservative philosophy, Paine then turns to John Locke's liberal tenets, which he summarizes as an optimism for human reasoning and the progress that follows, with a strong defense for individual rights and liberties, best achieved through a utilitarian ethics and a government that protects these. An even shorter summary of the short summary would read, conservatives value tradition, liberals value change. Paine then makes an interesting turn and says that these are the stereotypes of how liberals and conservatives think, but that research has shown that the vast majority of Americans do not have a political ideology, which means it doesn't make sense to label them, as most people at least, as either conservative or liberal. This is what he says. An ideology is a coherent system of ideas, and if people really had an ideology, then their opinions on why they take positions in favor of policies should have logical correlations. But the research suggests that 85% of the population lacks such coherence. It seems hard to believe. But think about what we've discussed thus far. People flip-flop, largely to stay in step with their tribe. The 15% of the population that does have a clear ideology is made up of politicians, journalists, and academics, the people doing all the screaming in the public sphere. And if these public figures are duking it out on adjacent TV screens in the gym, Fox News here, MSNBC there, what average people are consuming and aligning themselves with would appear to very much be an ideology. Yet I think Paine's point is interesting. I think he's arguing that ideology is a problem less because of the ideas in themselves and more because it tends to divide people into warring tribes. And when he stresses that 85% of the population really lacks consistency in how their ideas connect to one another, he's not so much trying to say that we're all stupid, I kind of think he is, so much as we are programmed to go along with our group. And that makes it look like we're all fanatics. Take this quote on page 65. Most people have no ideology if an ideology is understood as a coherent set of principles, or even a coherent set of issue opinions. What they have instead is group loyalties and the desire for their groups to dominate other groups. Paine then hits hard with the psychology of our need to be on the winning side, and how so many of our political arguments are serving an underlying psychological function. They're an attempt to reassure us that our side is justified in its desire to dominate the other. Our party should be in political power because they will do what's right. And here are all the reasons the other party will ruin everything. On to chapter 4. Chapter 4's title is Lincoln's Map. I studied history in my undergrad and ran an organic farm for 8 years, so I found the beginning of this chapter fascinating. Paine explains how the geology and the creation of limestone-rich, alkaline soil in the southeastern states of the U.S., combined with its heat, made perfect conditions for growing cotton. Combine this with the onset of the Industrial Revolution and the enormous increase in demand for cotton, a labor-intensive crop, and you get a scenario where the harvest is plentiful but the laborers are few. Unfortunately, the landowners didn't go and seek to pay people for their labor like they did in the Bible. Instead, they turned to chattel slavery. Paine astutely acknowledges that northern white people were not morally superior to southern whites, but because of circumstances, potential for profit due to soil and climate of location, they were not incentivized in the same way as southerners to keep slaves. Here's a quote. What really split the North from the South then was the fact that cotton was so much more profitable in the chalky southern soil than in the North. In the North, enslavers were conflicted about the economic self-interest of keeping their slaves and the moral force of Enlightenment ideas. Enslavers felt the same conflict in the South too, but the economic advantage was incomparably more powerful than in the North. The economic boom driven by cotton meant that the Enlightenment was simply overmatched in cotton-growing areas. This chalk line ultimately set people in the United States on two different paths. People who up to this point shared a similar history, culture, language, and religion. Going forward, each group would create its own justifications for why they were in the right and the other side in the wrong. This chapter centers around a map Lincoln studied during the Civil War. The map used data from the 1860 census to show the percent of population in each county that was enslaved. Lincoln wasn't dumb. He knew that the states that were most dependent on slavery would be the quickest to leave the Union and would fight the hardest. Sure enough, his prediction came true, and all the states that held the highest number of slaves seceded, starting with South Carolina, which had 57% of its population enslaved, and eventually, last but not least to join the Southern cause, was Tennessee, which had 25% of its population enslaved. Meanwhile, the border states like Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Delaware stayed in the Union, and no surprise, these states had smaller percentages of enslaved people, between 2 and 20% of the population. Smaller percentages, less incentive. Obviously, the North won, but just as obvious was that didn't mean that race relations were repaired. Reconstruction failed, and 100 years of Jim Crow segregation followed. Payne does a good job of summarizing the history here and explaining how the justifications surrounding slavery didn't vanish once it was banned, nor did the damage to Black families and culture get addressed. And like so many other authors, he points to the obvious reality that history lives on. The past shapes the present, which when you pause to think about conservative ideology and its emphasis on the importance of tradition, it'd be logical for conservatives to understand this better than anyone, but not logical when you think about how psychology works, right? That's the whole point of this book and chapter. So, quick note to all my white listeners. Payne accurately points out that white Northerners were no better than white Southerners. There existed a deep prejudice throughout the states. Instead, Payne is attempting to show how strongly circumstances play a role in what beliefs are passed down to the next generation. If you identify as a Republican or are listening to this, I encourage you not to write this chapter off. I don't think Payne is spinning a liberal bias here. I really believe he's just truth-telling, accurately retelling important history and human sin. I'm not suggesting that Payne doesn't have biases that are wrong, and I'll challenge one of them very shortly here, but I'm fully convinced this chapter is a truth we all need to come to terms with and learn how to heal from, which leads me into chapters 5 and 6. 2 chapters that I'm going to skim over as they didn't feel as weighty in his overall argument. Chapter 5 discusses how more education shapes our beliefs and cultural associations. Chapter 6 goes into how and why there's such a political divide between people that live in the country versus those that live in the city. But I do have some beef with chapter 7, titled God's People. So let's get into that. First, I would say that overall, I believe Payne is ultimately trying to say that no one side, liberals or conservatives, is better. And I applaud him for that. Everyone suffers from this human desire to be seen as good and reasonable, and we all have a need to bend reality to fit into our narratives. And there are times where Payne explicitly throws Democrats or liberals under the bus, and I think a truly fair reading of this book would see that. But at the same time, I think a truly fair reading of the book would simultaneously not shy away from calling him out in that his liberal affections have strongly influenced the number of examples he turns to illustrate his points. More often than not, I feel like he used conservatives as the group to critique. And that's unfortunate because for this kind of book, more than any other, ideally, the author would be super careful to spend equal time calling out each side of the aisle. In other words, I will applaud conservatives more than liberals for wading through this book because you're going to need to be psychologically more vulnerable and courageous to take all this in because your psychological immune system is going to be going into self-defense mode. But on the other hand, if what Payne is saying about human nature, that it is at its core self-justifying, if that's true, then really his thesis is only validated when he made academics and PhDs and atheists, the group he belongs to, out to be more enlightened. And since he identifies as an atheist, it's not surprising that his view of Christianity felt very negative. That is what we should expect his psychological immune system to be doing. However, I do wish some of his interpretation and commentary on Christianity could have been more nuanced and sophisticated. And I suppose, as I was reading those parts of the book, my own innate psychological immune system was aroused. I found myself thinking, yeah, you grew up in what sounds like the most shallow form of fundamentalist Christianity out there. And your whole life, you've been comparing that caricature to the best secular scholars you encountered in all your years of study. But I bet you don't even know of or haven't read Christian thinkers like Marilyn Robinson, Alvin Plantinga, Frederick Buechner, Christian Wiman, Robert Capon, and I could go on. But clearly this line of thinking, this backlash against Payne that I internally have, is rooted in my desire to justify myself and by extension the Christianity I ascribe to. The great irony though, and what does deserve to be said, is that the Christianity I confess is A, quite opposite to what he describes it to be, and B, it actually affirms his central thesis to this book. First, A, the faith I confess is also called Christianity, and he seems to be ignorant of it. And as I said, in many ways, it's the exact opposite of his caricature. For example, the definition of religion he provides on page 158 is this: religion is the ultimate system for assuring us that we are good and reasonable people, and that our groups are too. If you're listening to this, Payne, I would have you know that there are whole streams of the Christian tradition that completely contradict and overhaul that statement. A favorite theologian of mine, now passed on, Gerhard Forde, makes the polar opposite claim, saying that Jesus is God's big no to us, that the cross of Christ is God telling us we are not good and reasonable people. The center of the faith, Jesus' crucifixion, was the biggest attack on human righteousness ever. The Apostle Paul repeatedly asserts that his human righteousness is a joke, even an obstacle to God, and that for us to come to God means we must let go of any notion that we are good and reasonable and trust in the sheer mercy and grace of God. Now, I'm the first to admit that much of Christianity has been contorted into religion that matches your definition. But I don't think it's intellectually honest or fair just to lump it all together. I have all kinds of authors like Elul, who wrote The Subversion of Christianity, who understand that Christian faith in almost completely different terms from what's been described here, who make the point to contrast the gospel with religion or law. These are people who recognize that the early Christians were thought of as atheists because the gospel is so different from every other form of religion. But that's a digression for another video. But my second point, point B, if you will, is that the Christianity I follow actually aligns beautifully with your book's central thesis. If you aren't a Christian and don't want to listen to this next part, that's fine, but you might find it interesting. Please allow me to tell you about Tim Keller. For those of you who don't know Tim Keller, he was a pastor in Manhattan, New York City from around 1990 to 2015. He recently passed away from pancreatic cancer. Keller was unique in so many ways. For one thing, he had amazing integrity. He wasn't one of those mega church pastors in some scandal. But for another, he was the only one I ever heard who stood up at the pulpit and said to the 5,000 plus people gathered in the chairs that Christians need to be an enigma to society and politicians. We should not align neatly into political or cultural tribes. Because, he said, if we're taking the Bible seriously, we will learn that the faith does not fit neatly into either political camp. He said that there will be things we believe and do that will be liberal, and there will be things we believe and do that will be conservative, such that neither side will be comfortable with you. And Keller walked that walk. Someone like the artist Lecrae said Keller was the one white pastor he could listen to during a hard stretch for him, and he shared this with Kendrick Lamar. On the other hand, because of some conservative views that Keller stuck to, he was not allowed to speak at Princeton. But what is most interesting is that the gospel message that Keller preached, the gospel message he preached most about, was arguing that this human need to justify ourselves, and by extension the social group we belong to, is a psychological reality rooted in a spiritual condition. No one emphasized this more than Tim Keller. Take his famous sermon on the prodigal sons from Luke chapter 15, the sermon he used to open up his series for the vision of Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and he said it was his favorite text. The whole point of the sermon was that the elder brother in the parable represents the religious person and is just as lost as the younger brother, the one who recklessly runs away from the family and wastes the family's money on whores and alcohol. And he was just as lost precisely because the elder brother is not in a loving relationship with the father, but he's relying on the fact that he's a good, reasonable person. So he deserves all the father's wealth and attention. And because his identity is constructed around his own righteousness instead of love, he becomes enraged at the father's grace towards the runaway bad son. And in numerous other sermons, Keller insisted that the real spiritual problem with humanity is not our immorality, but our self-righteousness. We weaponize our goodness against God so we don't have to rely on God. He once quoted the Southern Gothic Christian writer Flannery O'Connor to this end, when one of her characters said, "There was already a deep, black, wordless conviction in him that the way to avoid Jesus was to avoid sin." Meditate on that for a lifetime. I bring all this up to say, if you're a Christian watching this, you can see that Keith Payne is actually doing an excellent job of explaining what the Bible already teaches, that deep down, at the root of our human psychology and or spirituality, humans have a need to justify themselves, to prove their goodness. These atheist psychologists are all in agreement. Jonathan Haidt opened his book, The Righteous Mind, saying, this is a quote, "I want to show you that an obsession with righteousness is the normal human condition." This is just what the Apostle Paul teaches. One other side note about his chapter on God's people Payne ends the chapter recounting his own journey away from Christianity. And again, it feels like an attempt to show that he is a reasonable and rational person for abandoning the faith. His whole reflection on Kierkegaard was essentially setting the stage for him to come to this climatic rejection of Christianity as irrational. But for the reader, I hope you recognize how binary and simplistic his thinking is here. He's having this debate with his mother, and he says to her, "But if you believe without reason and evidence, then there's no way to know which things to believe and not to believe." It's page 175. Granted, his mother is also a binary black and white thinker, but I just want to say that most of the Christians I know would say that they most definitely have reasons and evidence for their faith in Jesus. Reasons are not unimportant. It's just that reason alone is not enough. Faith is big enough to include reason and to recognize its limitations. There have been many people who have articulated this way more eloquently than I have, and having read them, Payne's commentary in this chapter just felt woefully myopic. And again, this is clearly my psychological immune system on the defense, so take it for what it's worth. But we're almost to the end of the book, so let's keep going. Chapter 8, it's titled Unbelievable. And it has this great quote from Catherine Dunn under the title that I'll just read for you. "The truth is always an insult or a joke. Lies are generally tastier. We love them. The nature of lies is to please. Truth has no concern for anyone's comfort." Oh, I feel like this is one of those like mic drop kind of moments. It's really good. In this chapter, Payne talks about conspiracy theories and misinformation. What is important to take away is that neither side is immune to these things. Surprise. Each side just believes in different types of conspiracy theories. A good summary of the chapter comes on page 187. When Republicans were the bad guys, Democrats tended to believe the theory. And when Democrats were the villains, Republicans believed. The effects of simple partisanship were much larger than any of the other factors like personality traits or cognitive style that the research had investigated. It turns out that if you make up just about any lie about the outgroup, many people will believe it. Again, this is scary. And it creates a marketplace for rationalizations. Payne says a lot more in this chapter, but if you step back, you can really just stop at that thought and understand the root of the problem. We are the problem. We are the ones demanding rationalizations. Yes, the news outlets and media are happily feeding it to us, and by no means the good guys, but for all this to change, we have to change. We have to stop wanting to rationalize and justify our beliefs and identity. If I got anything out of this chapter, it was that we need to take personal responsibility. We need to stop looking at these sources and seeking out rationalizations. In fact, this YouTube video is suggesting we do the very opposite. We look for the best thinkers on the other side to challenge us and help us grow personally, to help us understand others. Chapter 9, Winging It Together. In this chapter, Payne opens by saying, we have to find a way to live together. So let's take stock of where we are today. We are evenly divided between right and left, not based on ideologies, which few ordinary people have. We are divided by our social identities and by the stories we spin to reassure ourselves that we and our groups are good, reasonable people. One antidote to this division is to look at the research that shows while we do have different policy positions, in actuality, our differences are not as strong as we are made to believe. Studies show we have more in common than we think. The greater problem is that we are psychologically prone to exaggerate our differences, and particularly, we exaggerate how much the other side hates us. Payne's line is, we are more divided in our minds than in reality. I feel like Payne is starting to unwrap the problem here, but in my opinion, he doesn't give us a good actionable step to take. I'll be getting to that much more in an upcoming video, but he could prescribe this for his readers. Practice news sobriety. I personally have been news sober for 8 years, and I'm telling you, it's amazing. Detox forever. But again, that's for another video. There's too much to say. His next suggestion is to encourage us to not enter into debates about facts. Remember the Terry Real objectivity battles piece. Instead, go into conversations ready to truly listen to the other side. When someone feels like they're genuinely being listened to or heard, trust is formed, and no real progress will be made without this trust. Payne closes the book by explaining that he is not saying that you shouldn't be passionate about various causes or policies. These things matter and we should take action. But he says the only way to do this constructively is if we humanize the other side. We need to hold on to the fact that those on the other side are ultimately like us. People with this need to be seen as good and reasonable, this need to belong to a tribe and to be affirmed. We all have that in common. All right, on to the suggested reading list for liberals and conservatives. I'm filming this with my library in the background because I've seen a lot of YouTube videos. All the smart people always have their libraries in the background, so I pretend to be smart. Remember, the goal here is simply to move ourselves outside of our information silos, to encounter information from the other side to challenge us, help us grow. So I'm gonna start with 2 books that I'd recommend for conservatives and liberals alike that everyone can read. The first book is called Moderate Conservatism, Reclaiming the Center by John Keeks. John Keeks is a philosopher, and it reads like he's a philosopher, but I think it's a great book for liberals to read, to see kind of the logical coherence of conservatism, see it from a different light. It really helped me. But I also think it's a good book for contemporary Republicans to read, because the conservatism he advocates for felt very different from what I often see on the right. I think the current right wing has left a lot of what he's talking about. But if you don't want something as philosophical in nature, then I would recommend Love Your Enemies by Arthur Brooks. This is just, again, a good book to help challenge the spirit of polarization in our culture, Arthur Brooks. The second book I recommend is Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor by Halevi. This book I just found very poignant, felt very heartfelt as he's sharing his thoughts, but I felt like was desire to reach across the aisle and acknowledge the Palestinian struggle and desire, while staying true simultaneously to his own history as an Israeli citizen and the difficulty in that. So it's a poignant read, and I think it's very apropos for our current political tension. So Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor by Halevi. Okay. On to my list of books for liberals to read. The first and the most important book I recommend my fellow liberals to read would be Skin in the Game by Nassim Taleb. This is my first copy I bought. I liked it so much I ended up buying his whole Inserto series right here, hardcover, and read all of them. He's fascinating. And this book, I would say, is not so much a political book. It does a lot more with psychology and philosophy, but the implications are very, moved me politically. It made me see that socialism I previously admired had lots of holes in it. So Skin the Game by Nassim Taleb. The second book I recommend is called Conscious Capitalism by John Mackey, and he's the guy who founded Whole Foods. And I recommend this because it just, again, provides a good read for those of us who demonize capitalism, challenges that, and shows here's a guy with a heart and who advances the benefits of capitalism. The third book is Conscience and Its Enemies. Conscience and Its Enemies by Robert George. I had the privilege of hearing Robert George speak or give a lecture some time ago. And this is when I was much more to the left. But even then, I had a lot of respect for him, the way he communicated. He's a conservative with a big heart and is very thoughtful. And so I think this is a good book for any liberal to read and hear the other side. So the last book is The Constitution of Liberty by Hayek. This is a classic. It's kind of like a manifesto on free markets. And I used to never read these kind of books. So just recently, I'd always read anti-capitalist literature. But Hayek is in many ways a genius, and it's worth the read. So there's a lot that challenged me and I now agree with. There remains quite a bit that I find problematic though, or inaccurate, but I think it's an important read. All right, and here's my list of books for conservatives to read. The first, this is really for conservative Christians, is called God's Politics by Jim Wallis. I don't know what it is. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Jim Wallis. I think he's an outspoken Democrat, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I always got the feeling that he kind of arrived at his interpretation of Scripture through his politics versus the other way around. And I think all kinds of people are guilty of that. But that always irked me a little bit. I may be wrong, but that's just the impression I got. But even with that being said, I think Jim Wallis, his arguments in this book do dive deep into scripture, and they will challenge kind of Republican conservative notions. And the key takeaway for me, this is not the kind of book where I'm hoping conservatives read this so they become a liberal Democrat. Not at all. My hope would be that a conservative Christian would read this and realize that the Bible critiques not only the left, but also the right. And so there's a lot of Republican positions that Scripture has a lot to say about, that I feel like people's party allegiance has superseded their allegiance to Christ, and they've silenced the Scripture. So my hope is that a conservative Christian, after reading this, would not come away a Democrat, but they'd come away thinking they just want to be a Christian and leave some of their partisanship behind. The second book that I have my conservative readers read, if they haven't already, is called The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And I recommend this because a lot of times we don't change because of just intellectual arguments. We talked about that earlier in this video. Instead, we're changed by a movement of the heart, our heartstrings being pulled. And this book, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, it did that for me 25 years ago. It's an emotional book, but it's important. I think it can help. Third book, it's actually split here. I have two recommendations for the third book. One, if you attend church, I'd recommend The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby. If you are not a church attendee, then my recommendation would be My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, this book. Both these books, again, this is going to be more for the head than the heart, but get at what to me remains the greatest problem or flaw of the conservative political side, which is racism and the history surrounding that. And my heart's desire would be to see a renaissance of conservatism come about that once and for all sheds its prejudices and admits the sin of the past and seeks to repair it. And then so we can turn and focus on the quality aspects of conservatism, its family values and liberty. So that's my kind of my prayer. What I think would be beautiful, and I think it's really important right now. And the way I see it in the conservative right, racism and prejudice has kind of ebbed and flowed in America's history, and it seems like, and I'm kind of new sober, so I don't get this directly through TV, but through what I read and talk and hear, that we're in an uptick of racism currently in our culture. So, and last is Poverty by America. It's that's the title. It's actually by Matthew Desmond, and this is just a kind of a classic liberal analysis of America's economy, and I think it would really serve as like a yin to the yang of Hayek's book. So Poverty by America. Again, it's one-sided, and but the whole point here is we want to read the other side, and that when you read both sides, you come to see there's a little bit of truth over here, a little bit of truth over there. I want to take some of both of these and not be dogmatically on one side or the other and blind myself to reality. Again, that's been the huge benefit for me is I've had to move more right to the middle, and I don't even know if you want to call it to the middle, but I'm just basically I want to be the kind of person who can select ideas from this side, from that side, whatever I see as truth, and realize that sometimes there's two truths that are conflicting paradoxically, and how do you hold those together? But I think that's the reality I want to move into, and I'm inviting everyone else, all my listeners, to move in that direction too. I confess this video dove deep and was information dense. I'm going to release a handful of other videos outlining 5 steps we can take to become more free from partisan politics. And at times I'm going to attempt to make this information succinct and simple, but real change is not easy to achieve. And so I personally don't believe there's a shortcut we can take. Instead, for these 5 steps to be effective, we need to do the work each one requires. My goal in all of this is to synthesize the best thinking I can find. And I'm filtering it through what I found has personally, brought me freedom. A while back, I tried searching for videos on YouTube and in books too, that could act as guides or coaches for me, my desire to be free from partisan echo chambers. And I was shocked by how little guidance is out there. So my hope is just to fill some of that void, to be that coach or that cheerleader for someone else, and hopefully someone much smarter and more charismatic than me. I hate being on camera. I suck at it, as you can see. Will take up the mantle and run with it in ways that are beyond my limited skills. I'm saving the most important thing here for last. I'm guessing there are a fair number of you who followed along, intellectually understood, and even agreed with the research presented here. You want to be less biased. But when push comes to shove, you still can't help but feeling like, man, I remain convinced that the other side is still way more in the wrong, more dangerous. I cannot not feel that way. So if you're a Democrat, this phrase may be coming to your mind: justice takes sides. Or if you're a Republican, you may be thinking, morality matters. Compromising it has consequences. So whoever you are, if you're on the right or the left, there's a strong chance that you're thinking or feeling that I can't just abandon my beliefs or these causes for the sake of national unity, when that unity would be built on injustice or immorality. I know that's what's going through a lot of people's minds. It's gone through my mind. It's gone through close friends of mine. Okay, so please hear me out. I'm not saying injustice doesn't matter or morality doesn't matter. I believe on some issues there is a right way and a wrong way, and on many more there's a better way and a worse way, and many others are subjective. But here's my challenge. Does justice or morality get us anywhere without grace? Is it not binary and inaccurate to pit justice or morality against love and grace? In my book, love isn't opposed to justice. It includes justice, just like it includes morality. But love is ultimately bigger than these concepts. So yes, stay passionate about things you believe, pursue them. But at the end of the day, I don't believe justice or morality without grace will change our world. The vulnerable courage it takes to extend grace isn't at odds with justice or morality, but it adds to justice and it augments morality to ensure that no one gets left behind in our striving for human flourishing. Without grace, we're prone to misuse justice and morality. As all these psychologists have pointed out, we are self-justifying creatures, always rationalizing to protect our side. But the beauty of grace is that it undermines the need for self-righteous rationalizations. It and it alone has the power to disarm this instinct and for the first time make space for authentic human connection. I said this elsewhere, but I believe grace is the most undervalued word in our world. I hope and pray you experience it, and I hope you pass it along to those on the other side of the aisle. Thank you.
You have to practice for the practice part.
That's what's horrible, isn't it?